Hey there, friends. Mary Marshall here. Gotta get my water. I'm already a little scratchy. Mary Marshall here, and I'm sending a little video with this issue for this issue of Don't Wait, Grab Your Best Life Now. And what I wanted to do today is I'm going to Rosetta Stone a journal article for you. And I heard about this article, this study actually from on a podcast. And I do believe it was Beyond the Food with Stephanie Dodier with her podcast. And I've been kind of wanting to talk about GLP-1s, but I just hate talking about GLP-1s a little bit because there's just so much noise and so much pressure about them. And this was such a well done article that I was like, this is great. This is something people can look at and understand. And I just wanted to give you some information to help you make the right decision for yourself. In regards to whether or not to use these medications, and with no judgment either way, right? So I wanted to provide a good source of information. And what I liked about this study is that it does a good review of the clinical effects of GLP-1. It's actually GLP-1 RAs. So GLP-1 is a peptide, a protein in the blood that's involved with digestion and I'm just going to keep this super simple. And the receptors are on your cells, right? So it's GLP-1 is the peptide, R means receptor, A means agonist. So the receptors are the spots on your cells where that peptide, that GLP-1 binds, and this agonist, and the receptors can help. They open the door to the cell. They help that peptide do its job. So an agonist, right, is the opposite of an antagonist, right? So it's going to help that receptor do its job better. So that's just a simple description of what that actually means, right? But we all tend to call them GLP-1s. Okay. And so this study looks at the clinical information, safety, efficacy, what happens with withdrawal, and then it also looks at the marketing, like how the marketing was undertaken and how that played out in bringing these drugs to market. And that is such an important piece. So there are lots of there's the clinical studies that are out there that you don't hear anything about the marketing, and then there are some marketing studies that ignore the clinical aspect. So this is a good combination of both of those points of information, which I think is crucial to hear. And one thing I do want to say about the marketing techniques, if you will, in bringing this drug to market. These are, and I will say this again later, these are not isolated to these drugs, right? This is kind of a common playbook, but it's one that some people are unfamiliar with. So I want to make sure I should, kind of put that out there for you to take that into consideration. So the name of this study is GLP-1 Medications for Weight Loss, a Triumph of Marketing Over Patient Care. And the study authors are Reagan Chastain, Angela Meadows, and Louise Adams. These are all educators. Two of these women are psychologists. They are all, I will say, involved in advocating for fat-bodied people. That's a big part of their care and caring for them, advocating for them. Also studying the industry, studying the relationship between pharmaceutical influence and overweight and obesity. So they, are all well published. well educated. So you can read. I will definitely, and I do encourage you to click the link, go to the study itself, and check it out. And their biographies are all there. Now, one thing too that's interesting is that many of the researchers especially doing the clinical research for GLP-1 medications, are conflicted, right? They're paid for by pharma. They're on their payroll, literally. Sometimes they either overtly, or they are on their speakers bureau. They get fees for them. They're on on boards, and patient advocacy groups or lobbying groups, like government lobbying groups that the pharmaceutical companies give money to. They're in positions there, so they get money for that. So that is a source of conflict. And I apologize. I had a lovely script written up and I left it at work, so I had to rewrite it. So forgive me if I'm looking at my notes a little bit. So this study kind of goes through the evolution of GLP-1s from use in diabetes treatment to use of weight loss drugs, and it looks at their how they work, how safe they are, and in terms of how they work for weight loss and prevention of cardiovascular problems. Okay, they also look at the withdrawal, what happens with withdrawal, and safety factors and side effects, and as I said, then the marketing and bringing these drugs to market, how they brought them to market. So these drugs were initially developed for treatment of type 2 diabetes, and people would start at a low dose, increase the dose to tolerance to get to, it's called a hemoglobin A1C, a blood sugar level that was tolerable for people, and they stopped there, right? But with weight loss, when they started noticing that these drugs help people lose weight, there was no parameter. It was just how much can you tolerate to get weight loss, right? So, and the doses are like near doubled, right? So that's something, that's just something to know. And okay, so do these drugs work, right? They do for about a year, right? Consistent studies show that these drugs, and they work by suppressing appetite, slowing gastric emptying time, meaning food sits in your stomach and in your gut for extended periods of time. It decreases appetite. We're not really, and that's kind of a brain thing it does that they don't really know how it works in the brain, right? So, I think it's always concerning, not a little concerning, when you don't quite know how something's working, because if you don't know what it's doing, you don't know what else it's doing, right? But that's just me. That's not part of the study here. Okay. But the drugs do work. People lose significant weight in the first year. After that, it plateaus, right? And even starts to rebound, even while still on the medication, right? And there are also reports of, weight loss of 20%, right? Well, weight loss is reported in the studies. It's reported as an average, right? So if I lost 5 pounds and you lost 25, right? That would mean our average weight loss would be 15 pounds, right? Which makes my 5 pounds look a whole lot more, right, than that. And what actually has happened in these studies is that this really misconstrues the efficacy, how well the drugs work. 25 to 50% of the people in studies didn't even lose 10%. And up to 50%, around 50% didn't even lose 15% of their weight. And in one study, 70% of the trial participants on the drug did not lose even 15% of their weight. So you maybe had a couple people lose a lot of weight, and that kind of misconstrued the appearance of a 20% weight loss when that wasn't experienced by the majority. And these numbers, like looking at all the individual weight loss, these were buried in what's called the summary information or supplemental data, which isn't easy. It's not peer reviewed and it's not easily accessible if you go and look at a study, right? And try to read through it, or you get a study abstract that just summarizes the study. So they report weight loss in averages. Now, there was one trial that showed a maintenance of weight loss it was a 4-year trial. So at the end of the 4 years, they're like, oh yeah, we've got people maintaining weight loss. A little bit of information that was also hidden in the supplemental data was that 8,800 people started in the treatment arm getting the drug. When they checked to see how many people were maintaining their weight loss, there were only 921 left. That's like 10% of the study population was left. So they didn't have data for 90% of the people in the study. So that's just not an accurate, and that too buried in the supplement, the summary data. So that's a little bit about efficacy. And again, I'm kind of going over highlights of the study. I'm going to try to keep it as kind of short as possible. I'm not good at that, but I do highly encourage you, whenever you hear a podcast, see a headline, or hear something on the newscast, or read something on Facebook, that you go and look at the original study that they're talking about. That's like one of the best things you can learn from me or anybody else about kind of looking at scientific information. So another point of efficacy that the trials that were included in this study looked at was benefits for cardiovascular health. And this is touted for the GLP-1s. Oh, they're so good for cardiovascular health. Well, let's look at that. And I remember I was presenting on GLP-1s quite a few when this happened in the SELECT study. And that was looking for Wegovy, right, which is the semaglutide is the generic name. Most people call it Ozempic, but Ozempic is the dosage for diabetes. Wegovy is the weight loss dosage. Same drug, right? Just different dosage. But they were looking at that drug and looking for cardiovascular benefits. And I remember that headlines were coming out. Oh, and the SELECT trial, 20% reduction in cardiovascular incidence. And that's a big drop, right? If you're at risk for heart trouble and you're worried about that, and someone says, oh, this drug will help you reduce your risk by 20%, you might be considering that. Here's the tricky part, right? And this happens a lot in reporting of all kinds of drugs. That 20% risk reduction, which was touted in press releases, right? There were press releases, science by press release, before the study was peer-reviewed or published, right? So all people could see was this 20% claim. They couldn't see the numbers and the data in the study. But what the difference? 1.5% was the actual difference in cardiovascular events for people who took the drug and people who did not. 1%, 1.5%, that's not such a big deal, is it? Especially when you consider the side effects. right? And if you consider this little nugget of information, that the majority of the people in the study, the majority of the population were white males. When they looked at how well the drug worked for different, they call it subgroup analysis, looking at different types of groups of people, they found that there was no significant effect for women, for people between age 55 and 75, for Hispanics, and for people whose BMI was over 35. So I'll just leave you with that. Okay. And again, that data was hidden in the summary data. The Summit trial looked at tirzepatide, and they looked at cardiovascular or benefit for weight loss in people who had obesity and a certain kind of heart failure. And they had the trial endpoint, like what they were looking for was this composite death from heart failure and cardiovascular incidents. And for that, they did have a good degree of success or efficacy, right? It worked pretty well. But here's the thing. That trial, when they did the trial, that was not the endpoint that they started with. And they changed the endpoint like way into the study. Let me see if I can. And they reported the endpoint. They didn't introduce that into the study until like 3 years. That's not, you're trying to figure something out. The initial endpoint was deaths from heart disease, right? And so what happened was nobody wrote this anywhere, but when you don't get the endpoint, you don't meet your endpoint, well, your drugs failed, but let's change the endpoint so to make it look good. And so again, that information was hidden, and that's a big no-no in the scientific community. Like when you do research, that's a big no-no in research, is to change your endpoint. It's really not good science. All right. So that's a little bit about how well the drugs work, right? They work till they don't, which is at about a year. And then weight rebounds, right? It usually starts to rebound even while on the drug. So pharma's answer is, well, keep taking the drug just to kind of keep that minimized. But there's absolutely no evidence, no research to support, is that safe? Is it effective? What other harms are going to be done? So that's just a big roll of the dice. We know for heart disease, the benefit is highly overstated in the research, right? 1.5% reduction of risk with Wegovy for heart cardiovascular events versus the 20% that they claimed, right? And tirzepatide, kind of a shady improvement there in patients with heart failure. And it's a particular kind of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. So how about safety, right? Maybe people are like, well, I just want to give it a shot. And I know there's desperation to lose weight that we feel that's kind of imposed on us from the way people who are of high weight are treated. So, but is it safe? And, these drugs work by making you not want to eat, decreasing appetite, making food sit in your stomach. So side effects are nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, reflux, right? So you feel like crap half the time and you don't want to eat. Not eating can cause dehydration, malnutrition, right? So it can cause a lot of problems. It can also increase risk of eating disorders. And anorexia is one of the deadliest psychiatric illnesses that there is. And it's just as deadly in people of high weight as in people of low weight. So also other very common, or I won't say common, but not uncommon, was pancreatitis, or a real concerning finding. In the UK, there was such an increase in pancreatitis as the use of GLP-1s, they were occurring together, that they did a study, and they did find at the time they were there was no causation established, but they did find that 10 patients, as of August, I think it was August of 2025, 10 patients who were taking weight loss drugs had died, right, or from pancreatitis. And these drugs also disrupt drug absorption. You can kind of think of that, right? Especially by slowing, if you take other drugs orally and you're slowing the gastric emptying time and your intestinal motility, they can affect fetal development. And there's on both tirzepatide and semaglutide, or Wegovy, Ozempic, there are black box warnings for thyroid cancer. And as of, so those are all, and a black box warning is, that's imposed by the FDA on the drug information sheet, and that's a serious concern. As of August 2025, there were 423 deaths associated with tirzepatide and 760 associated with semaglutide or Wegovy. This far exceeds, drugs have been taken off the market for far fewer deaths than this, yet these drugs are still on the market. I don't know what that says, right? So that's efficacy, that's safety. Let's talk a little bit about marketing. And this, please pay attention to this, because this, once you kind of start to hear this and look for this and look for it with other drugs, you'll notice it. Again, a lot of the research that you see especially on the clinical end of these medications, the researchers are on the payroll of the pharmaceutical companies. Some even hold stock in the companies. So Novo Nordisk, who is the manufacturer of semaglutide, they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars, right, to get these drugs to market. And in 2015, right, we're in 2026 now. In 2015, in their annual report, they shared a 10-year strategy to create a market to bring these new weight loss drugs to market. And the title of this section of the annual report was Obesity Care, Building a Market from Scratch. It wasn't like, oh, here's this problem that needs a solution. Let's find a solution. It's like, no, we've got these drugs. Let's find these drugs. Let's find a way to get them out there and sell as much as we can. So the main point of the plan, the first focus was to create legitimacy and urgency for the medical management of obesity. And this is from their documents, right? This isn't something someone else is saying. This was their plan. This was what they set out to do, was to create legitimacy and urgency for the medical management of obesity. First, by promoting obesity as a disease. And they would even coach patient groups, right? every interview you have, you say obesity is a disease. Obesity is a disease 20 times, right? Every interview. That was from Obesity Canada. Somebody in that group shared that. So the goal was to promote obesity as a disease. There are physicians on shows or writing articles in magazines. Well, someone's like incentivizing them to do that. So sharing this idea that obesity is a disease. They fund research to support that obesity is a disease. They pay researchers. Hey, we'll pay you to do this study. And then they influence professional guidelines, right? So the doctors now, when you do an assessment of a patient, do you address obesity and overweight? And those professional guidelines then influence education at all levels, right? And they influence so many things. And they influence how healthcare professionals do their job, of course. And they lobby and target healthcare professionals via education, continuing education, lobby for reimbursement and funding, lobby for these medications, right? Create patient advocacy groups, right? So these are all ways that these companies spent millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars at least. And there's a lot of and that's what's is reported. We know there's lots of misconduct and underreporting and non-disclosure of conflicts of interest in research and speaking and health promotion. But here's just a couple little tidbits here. In the UK, Novo Nordisk was suspended for 2 years from the British pharmaceutical industry. And let me see what that was. Because of inappropriately and dangerously marketing Saxenda to healthcare professionals. In the U.S., Novo Nordisk was fined $58.65 million in 2010 for deliberately downplaying the thyroid risks of Victoza. And Victoza is liraglutide. It was the diabetic formulation of another GLP-1, right? But even so, the profits for that drug were over $1 billion. So and this is what happens with pharmaceutical companies. They kind of laugh at fines they do. It's kind of the cost of doing business. They still made, $500 million, right? So, or $500,000. Is that right? No, $500 million, because the profits were $1 billion. They had to pay a $58 million fine. So a little less than half. So that was kind of the discussion that sort of summarizes, that's how these drugs were brought to market. That was sort of the marketing ploys to really, and you think marketing is, all the commercials that you see on TV. Yes, it's that, which are unbelievable, but it's all the other things, all the research that you see, all the professional guidelines that get changed, this influencing the industry, the healthcare industry itself, and imposing that information on them. So things to take into consideration if you are thinking, well, geez, everybody seems to be on these drugs. I know people who and I just don't think they even qualified for these drugs. And it's kind of like, And you've got a doctor saying, well, hey, I've got this drug. And they kind of make it seem like they cure everything from, I don't know, acne of course, to weight loss, which is what, people so deeply desire. But remember, it's not a cure. There's not a cure. And we shouldn't feel like we need to feel sick and not be able to enjoy food and to feel nauseous and ill and just to not even want to eat. So we shouldn't feel like we have to endure that for thinness. Right? Please consider whether you like your body or not, or how it looks. Please consider treating it with respect and compassion, because you do deserve that. And I know this is kind of a sciencey sort of talk, and it's a little bit long, but I really just wanted to get this information out to you and share the study. I think it's so important to hear the whole story, right? So I hope it helps you, to maybe share it with somebody else, at least the study link. Please look at that. Please check out the whole study. These ladies have done a really good job with this, and it's great information and tons of references to check out to see for yourself. All right. I hope you're enjoying the summer. I hope you have a great weekend if you're reading this on Friday, or, next weekend. I hope that's great too. So take care. Bye.